Andy could join us too, but there's not enough room in front of my desk. She's got plenty. So it's not that I don't I actually kind of enjoy reading through the things, but I wanted to have enough time to cover some other things. So we're going to do some skipping today. Uh,
Okay.
we're going through the period of the divided kingdom, and we're at the beginning of chapter 11 of Second Kings. But I'm going to skip right away a little bit of that. Oh, I made a list and now I don't know where I put it. Right here. So we are going to have, there's, like we've heard in other places, we're going to have several chapters of the two kingdoms fighting against each other and against outside kingdoms. What I would do, just kind of look at the titles of each section. We're going to skip ahead. In one place it says the temple repaired. We're not going to read that one today, but what's interesting is it reminds me of conversations we've had at church, right? It says the money is being brought to maintain the church, but it's being used for other things. Now, why are you not repairing the house? Why are you handing it over for other things? And so it's interesting, we're talking about maintaining our budget, and prioritizing and things. And it's a similar conversation, even back, I don't know, 5,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Money was being taken and being used, and not necessarily in a bad way, but the church, the temple was kind of starting to fall apart. And they said, if you're taking the money and using it for other things, why can't you use some of it to make sure that the building is maintained? So they made a way so that it would be they actually have an offering box. They took a chest, made a hole in his lid and set it beside the altar as one who entered the house of the Lord. The priest who guarded the threshold put in it all the money that was brought into the house of the Lord. So they had a donation box, a giving box.
Yeah.
That's the beginning in the middle of chapter 12.
Some things don't change.
Yep. But I think sometimes money has been I know very few churches where the money is really mishandled. It's the question of, to me, mishandling and prioritizing are different things.
Yeah.
Right. It's not that there aren't a lot of priorities, right? But sometimes we miss the things that are more important. So we're going to skip all the way to chapter 17. But I would say, as you're going through, look at the different titles and stuff of things as you're going through. It's mostly almost every section it's a new king takes over. And we hear, of course, I just have to do this for the sake of the last 5 weeks. We hear this. Now all the rest of the acts and all that he did are written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel.
Yeah, we know what you're going to say.
I read that. It happens all the time. So
the only thing I found of interest about this one in these past chapters was about when during one of the attacks that some people were trying to bury a dead man, and they were starting to flee for their lives, so they threw his body into Elisha's grave, and that it revived him, and he jumped up and jumped out of the grave. I couldn't keep from laughing.
Yeah, there's a few interesting stories.
Yeah, and then until you get up to Hezekiah, it doesn't really get interesting. It's just all repetitious.
It's just a new king rules, and sometimes they rule for quite a few years.
Yes.
But I wanted to jump to 17 for a reason, and that is, well, partly in Second Kings, it's there's a lot of what's left is, and then a new king takes over and a new king rules. But then in 722, not in 586. 586, I don't know if you all remember what the significance of that year is. That's when the people are taken in exile in Babylon. But in 722, something very similar happens, although it's a little bit different. We can turn on. Okay. Hey, Sandy, can you shut the door and turn on the AC? Poor Pat is melting here. So in 722, I believe that's the date I'm looking. The Assyria enslaves Israel. And so I wanted to read that what just the part in Second Kings that talks about that. And then we have a couple other little sections I want to read in Second Kings. And then we're going to skim the majority of the two books of Chronicles. But there's a reason. I want to when we finish Second Kings, I want to talk a little bit about Chronicles is actually a really interesting book for a couple reasons when we get there. So I'm going to read this 17th chapter, starting with the 5th verse of the 17th chapter. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria. For 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He carried the Israelites away to Assyria. He placed them in Halah on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. So we had this before, well, not before, it happens after. But we've talked about this when we read Isaiah and Jeremiah in particular, but many of the prophets, they're over the conquest of Israel by Babylon. A couple of them are referred to the conquest of Assyria, but most of what we read, like in Isaiah, connects with Babylon, and that's kind of important. But it happened twice. So it happened with the nation of Assyria also. Starting with verse 7. This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They had, okay, you're good. They had worshipped other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had introduced. The people of Israel secretly did things that were not right against the Lord their God. They built for themselves high places at all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and sacred poles on every high hill and on every green tree. There they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did whom the Lord carried away before them. They did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. They served idols of which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do this." Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes, in accordance with all the law that I commanded your ancestors and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets." They would not listen, but were stubborn as their ancestors had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. I want to stop for a second. This happens a lot in Scripture. It's the reason that they're being conquered is not because an army is coming, but because they were morally bad.
Mm-hmm.
Which
Mm-hmm.
I weirdly I think that's unhealthy theology today, right? Like, well, these bad things happen to you. Bad things happen to you. Like if something, I don't know, you have an accident or something. Well, it must be because you needed that person. I struggle with that kind of theology. It's this punishing God, right? It's this God that doesn't have a lot of grace. But I would say that I don't think God changes. I think their interpretation of what happened changed. Their understanding of God changed, right? So they said, well, we must have done something bad because this bad thing happened to us, right? It's not that God punishes them, because that's how it sounds. That's how it sounds. Well, God punishes you.
But in the reading this morning in Larry's prayer book, part of it was the thing that we believe in is that you are saved by faith.
Yes.
And not by works.
Right.
So with that in mind, that would counteract the other.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, it's not that people like to say that God changed between Old and New Testament. I don't think God changed. I think people's understanding of God changed. They thought that God was a God that would punish you if you know. But then we have problems like it happened back then too. Well, how do you explain a natural disaster or a child dying or something like that? Who's being punished, right? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, then they might go back to the fact that when Moses was leading the people over the land, over the desert, then if they did bad things, then he punished them.
Right. Well, yeah, it connects with that. So,
Do you think that's what people thought back then?
well, what's funny is all throughout the Old Testament, there are two covenants that go back and forth, and people who do a lot more studying of, like, theologians. I guess I'm kind of a theologian, but theologians who do that for a living. There's two covenants. There's the Abrahamic and the Mosaic covenant, and Mosaic meaning from Moses, and Abrahamic meaning from Abraham, and both those started in Genesis, right? But the Mosaic covenant, the people that believed in the Mosaic covenant, that when they write, like in Second Kings, they're writing in this God that's a give and take, right? That's a punishing if you do bad and a rewarding if you do good. The Abrahamic covenant, which still exists in the Old Testament in other places, is I love you no matter what.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not that God changes; it's the people that write about God have different views of God. Right. Even from one book to the next.
Right.
Right. Some of them believe in this God that punishes, and some of them don't. And so you have, it's kind of, it goes back and forth. It's not that God changes; it's people's understanding of how God works.
And that's still happening today.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. So I'm going to continue reading through a little bit more of this. Verse 15, they despise his statutes and his covenant that he made with their ancestors and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false. They followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do as they did. They rejected all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves cast images of two calves. This is the third time they've done that, by the way, just in our readings. They made a sacred pole, worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. They made their sons and their daughters pass through fire. They used divination and augury, and they sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah alone. So remember, there's two tribes: the tribe of Israel in the north and the tribe of Judah in the south. And they are the tribe in the Samaria is in the middle at this time, not at the time of Jesus, but at this time they're sort of connected. They will be separated by the time of Jesus. But part of the reason they end up being separated is that happened. So the tribe of Judah, where Jerusalem isn't affected as much. The Assyrians take away the northern kingdom, essentially. All the leaders, the landowners, just like the Babylonians do later on. They leave the area of Judah in the south, where Jerusalem is. When the Babylonian time comes, all the people from both areas, the leaders, the landowners, take from both areas. And then I'm going to just the next section, starting with verse 24. The title is Assyria resettles Samaria. So Samaria is the section between Judah and Israel. And what ends up happening when the people come back from Assyria, the historic Assyrians are still in that area between Judah and Israel, right? So we have Samaria, this place that we hear about, the Good Samaritan, all these bad people that are in between, is a mixture of so many different cultures, right? It's a mixture of former Jews who were some of the 12 tribes of Israel. It's a mixture of people from local nations that they've been fighting with, that we've been talking about, and it's a mixture of Assyrians who live far, far away, but they settled in that area between the two Jewish camps. So they're in some ways historically Jewish, but they have so many other influences from other places too. We're going to skip ahead just a little bit to chapter 19. And there's an important thing I want to bring up that I'm going to talk about more here. So it says, chapter 19, Hezekiah consults Isaiah. What I've told you, I haven't lied to you. I've said the Bible is not chronological, but for the most part, the Old Testament follows a chronological order. There are big overlaps, though, so we need to think of each section as sort of overlapping other sections. The history section runs not all the way to the time of Jesus, but within a couple hundred years of Jesus, 200 years of Jesus, from thousands of years before. So we see this title, Hezekiah Consults Isaiah. Well, the book of Isaiah is much, much later, but the history books start with 1st and 2nd Samuel, and well, actually, they start with Judges, and they run through Ezra and Nehemiah, but they overlap I'm doing it like this so you kind of see the overlap the time of the prophets, which is the part of the Bible and also the time that runs up to about the time of Jesus. So we're going to now overlap some of those books. In between is the section of poetry, which includes Psalms and Proverbs, and includes a few other books, Song of Solomon and a few others. Those were written anywhere from Solomon, which is a long time before, all the way up into the prophets. So all three of those, if you think of like different sections in the library, right? Each of those sections overlaps, in some cases, the same period of time, right? There are actual charts that they make. Now, the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, is all the full. And if you think about the starting times of each section is probably chronological. So the starting time of the history books is right after Moses. The starting times of the poetry books is around Solomon, David and Solomon. The starting time of the prophets is much later, a couple thousand years later. But they all 3 of them overlap. All 3 of those sections. They don't overlap with the Torah, because the Torah is pretty much written before any of this other stuff happens. So that'll become very apparent when we get into Chronicles, which we are going to do today. But I want to read a little bit in chapter 19 and another chapter a little later. So we have Hezekiah consults Isaiah. So we get a little idea of the overlap with Isaiah. Isaiah is not the earliest prophet. There are prophets before him. Well, we already talked about Elijah and Elisha, there's no books for them, right? But Isaiah, even though it's one of the bigger books of the prophets, there are some of the prophets that exist that we have, the books of the prophets that existed before Isaiah. So we're going to read these first 7 verses of chapter 19. When King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes. So when he heard that I believe I'm going to go back up.
The book of the law.
What happened before? There had been.
The book of the law was discovered.
Yeah, right. He tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. And he sent Eliakim, who was in charge of the palace, and Shebna the secretary, and the senior priest covered with sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah son of Amoz. They said to him, "Thus says Hezekiah, this day is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth. It may be that the Lord your God heard all the words of the Rabshakeh, whom his master the king of Assyria has sent to mock the living God, and will rebuke the words that the Lord your God has heard. Therefore lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left." When the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, "Say to your master, thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have reviled me. I myself will put a spirit in them, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land. I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land." So the reason I brought this up, even though we skipped some of the story, is that Isaiah becomes a very important prophet in the history of the people. And do you notice that, who are we talking about here? Are we talking about the Babylonians or the Assyrians? It's the Assyrians, right?
The Assyrians.
They were already taken into captivity in Assyria. and that's probably has happened for some time. The difference in time between the captivity in Assyria is over 100 years. 586 is when Babylon happens, and and Isaiah writes over both sections. There's part of a reason that we believe Isaiah was written by at least two, if not three or four different writers, because the amount of time between the beginning events of Isaiah and the end events of Isaiah is 200 years, 220, 230 years, and the writing style changes. And people say, well, it's got to be the same person. It's okay. It's okay if other people write. They contribute to the book or whatever.
How do you know which is his?
Well, right. Which is who's the real? What's that show? That old show? Will the real Isaiah please stand up? Yeah, yeah.
Or could it have been disciples of Isaiah following?
Exactly. Well, we know that happened with Paul, even, right? There were books that were written in Paul's name that we know for sure aren't Paul. Isaiah is written over 250 years, and the style of writing changes. They write about the Assyrian in Isaiah. Part of the Assyrian exile is written, and then later on Babylonian exile. So there's got to be, and I've had people say, well, it's because they lived a really long time back then. Some of that is misunderstood.
Well, did they tell time the same way we do?
Right, yeah. So I wanted to bring that up because Isaiah's and it's not a different Isaiah. This is the same Isaiah. Because when you read Isaiah, the beginning of Isaiah talks about the Assyrian threat, and then later on Babylon. We're going to skip again to chapter 24. We have some more kings, different changes in kings. And just 5 chapters later, Judah overrun by enemies. Now, this is 140 years later. So those 5 chapters covered 140 years. And most of those were, there's some battles, there's some things, but most of those are a new king takes over, and there's a couple interesting stories in there. There's an interesting reformation of Josiah. But we are to King Nebuchadnezzar, who comes to Babylon. So I'm going to read the first 7 verses of this, and then we're going to do a little bit with Chronicles. In his days, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came up. Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. The Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldeans, bands of the Arameans, bands of the Moabites, and bands of the Ammonites. He sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servants the prophets. Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord to remove them out of his sight, for the sins of Manasseh, for all that he had committed, and also for the innocent blood that he had shed. For he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to pardon. Now the rest of the deeds of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? So Jehoiakim slept with his ancestors, and his son Jehoiachin succeeded him. The king of Egypt did not come again out of his land, for the king of Babylon had taken over all that belonged to the king of Egypt, from the Wadi of Egypt to the river Euphrates. So we have in what is in other books a much bigger description, and here my Bible says, because of in the mind of the narrator, the fate of Judah has already been sealed. Little time is spent in describing the events, the achievements of Jehoiakim. The text relies completely on his relationship with the Babylonians. So, in just 5 chapters, we are conquered by the Assyrians, and then we're conquered by the Babylonians. In 120 years in between, stuff happened. Kings ruled, but largely, right? It's the same argument we read just a few chapters ago. The reason that they're overrun by the Babylonians is that the king and the people disobeyed God. Right? It's the same kind of
a circle that just keeps going round and round and round.
Right. And not what's really happening, which is because there are other kingdoms that are trying to expand their reign, right? So we have what becomes the capture. I'm going to skip just a tiny bit here to verses 13 to verse 13 in the same chapter. He carried off all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasure of the king's house. He cut into pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord, which King Solomon of Israel has made. All this as the Lord had foretold. He carried away all Jerusalem, all the officials, all the warriors, 10,000 captives, all the artisans and the smiths. No one remained except the poorest people of the land. He carried away Jehoiachin to Babylon, the king's mother, the king's wives, his officials, and the elite of the land. He took into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. The king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon all the men of valor, 7,000, the artisans and the smiths, 1,000, all of them strong and fit for war. The king of Babylon made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. So we talked about this before. Most of the prophets refer to the Babylonian exile. Some of them, including Isaiah, are in the Babylonian exile. But you notice who do Babylon take away? Do they take everybody? They don't take everybody.
No. They take on the cream of the crop, we might call them.
They take the leaders, they take the officials, the warriors, and this is what I find is interesting: the artisans and the smiths.
They want people to work for them.
They want people to work for them. Now, I'm going to go back to the conversation we've had before when we've had some of these other Bible studies. So, what happens in a power vacuum? Right? They don't leave anybody there. They don't leave an army there. They just leave, and they leave the poor people there. And no one comes back for 2 or 3 generations, 100 years, 90 to 120 years. Well, I guess your perspective changes whether you're one that goes with them to Babylon or you're one that stays behind in the land. Right? And we had prophets who did both. Isaiah and Jeremiah are taken to Babylon. Some of the prophets stay back behind. So their perspectives are very, very different, right? The perspectives of those stay back behind, they said, well, as far as we know, they're all dead. So let's rebuild.
At that time, do you have the cream rise to the top again?
I think you
That
do.
would happen. That happens usually.
And they took over the land because they didn't know anyone was coming back. And they took over the roles, the positions as best they could, but all the people of power had gone. Yeah. And so they didn't have the ability or the money or the means to lift the temple again. The temple's been destroyed now, right? So we have for generations people taking over the land again, and then all those people, well, their children and grandchildren come back and say, "This is my land." I mean, it's amazing they got through any of that.
Land war, yeah.
Right. This is my land. I've been here for 3 generations. I've been here for 100 years. What do you mean it's your land? If I bought a house, let's say I bought my house here in Roswell, and someone said, "Hey, this was my grandmother's house, and she never actually sold it. She just left.
Yeah.
You need to give it to me now." I'd look at the person like they were crazy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But that's basically what ends up happening. And it seems like from what we can read later on, they did it in a relatively peaceful way somehow, right? Especially considering very few people that left came back. I mean, maybe nobody, right? So it's their children and grandchildren. It makes it even harder because they can't say, "Well, I remember you."
Right.
They don't remember each other, right? So this one little 13 to 17, 5 verses here, is kind of a lot of verses in the prophets were written because of these 5, what's described in these 5 verses, right? About the people being taken away, about the temple being destroyed. A lot of what happens in the prophets. This is sort of the more succinct sort of description of what happened. We don't actually hear that. The prophets don't say, "Well, they took away the artisans, they took away the traders, they took away the warriors," right? This is describing what we hear about them lamenting in the prophets. And then we come to Chronicles. We are not going to read very little of Chronicles. I will tell you the first 10 chapters are all names. Do you want to read 10 chapters of names? I don't. But we have the generations. Why? This is a good question. Why do you think a lot of books start with names, including a couple of the Gospels?
To tell you who they are,
Yeah, and
what line they're in.
establishing their authority,
Mhm.
right? So we have, this is a book of history, so it's saying, okay, this is who, it's a record, right? This is, and then each of the 12 tribes, it talks about all their descendants all the way down, where they live, for 10 chapters, literally 10 chapters. And we end, or 9 chapters, I guess. And we end in chapter 9. We'll skip to chapter 9 of First Chronicles.
Excuse me.
Bless you.
There are a few names here too, but so at the end of all of this, we hear, so all Israel was enrolled by genealogies, and these are written in the book of the kings of Israel. And Judah was taken in exile in Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. Now the first to live again in their possessions in their towns were Israelites, priests, Levites, and temple servants. We just talked about this, right? Where the people are gone to Babylon, and who lived in their possessions in their towns? It was these people, right, that were left behind. Inhabitants of Jerusalem after the exile. Who was living there? I'm not going to go through a lot of that. So what's interesting about Chronicles to me, about the 2 books of Chronicles, is it sums up more events over more time than all that we've read before. So all we read before has some of the individual events, even though there were times that they said, well, don't you know that it was all written in the book of the kings of Israel? From Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Kings, Samuel is all sort of summed up in Chronicles. So if you really want to read all of the history of all of the people of Israel from the time of Moses to the time of almost to the time of Jesus, read First and Second Chronicles, and it's a little bit of an easier read. So what we are going to do is I'm going to intentionally sort of be thumbing through this and skimming. So if you look at just look at the titles of each section, we still have some names here. The end of chapter 9, the family of King Saul, the death of Saul and his sons, David anointed king of all Israel, in the beginning of chapter 11. David's mighty men and his exploits. We read a lot of this already. David's followers in the wilderness. I'm skipping all the way to chapter 14 and 15, defeat of the Philistines and the ark brought to Jerusalem. You see how we just covered what was 50 chapters of the other books we just read, which were all pretty much back to back in order in sequence. But Chronicles overlaps that, right? Chronicles is summarizing a lot of what we labored through reading. The ark placed in chapter 16. God's covenant with David, chapter 17. David's administration. I'm going to skip ahead. I'm skipping intentionally some of this. We are going to go back to reading again, but David prepares to build the temple in chapter 22. And then, did David build the temple?
No.
No.
But even in the books we read before, we know that David had made a plan to build a temple. and then his son Solomon ended up building the temple. So David ends up dying, and the temple is built by Solomon. We're going to skip again to chapter 28. Solomon instructed to build the temple. Instructed by David. David's still around. There were many chapters in, I think, Samuel about all those, all the measurements and everything, and what was gilded and what was, all that stuff. But I kind of like Chronicles in the sense that it even in these chapters, there's a lot of names listed and stuff, but it sort of summarizes what we all just read in some ways. So Solomon is instructed to build a temple, and then at the very end of First Chronicles, we have the summary of David's reign. If you just read Chronicles, remember when we read the part of David back in Kings and Samuel, David was more of a scoundrel than a great leader. He had his moments, but he was and he was anointed by God. But if you just read Chronicles and you don't read those things, David is a lot more. He has more leadership qualities.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I read a long time ago that the Chronicle more or less eulogized him and lifted him up more than the Kings did.
And I think this is because it's two different writing styles. I think that Samuel and Kings is really trying to give you a blow-by-blow account. Like we heard, and then he went to this house, and then he went to the woods, and then he did this, and then he got in this battle. Where it's not that either one is that one's right or the other one's wrong. It's that we miss some of the things that the good positive acts that he did, because we're so hearing about this battle and that battle and this thing and that thing with in the Kings and Samuel. And here in Chronicles it says, here's these great things here's the highlights of David's administration. Right.
Well, one may seem more human than other.
Yeah, for sure. So First and Second Chronicles pretty much are just continuations of each other. So David, the First Chronicles ends with the end of David. Second Chronicles goes over a lot more. We have the building of the temple in chapter 3 of Second Chronicles. We did hear about that, and we have the measurements again here. I'll just read a couple verses because I actually think it's really interesting. I like woodworking, so that's probably why. These are Solomon's measurements, chapter 3, verse 3. These are Solomon's measurements for building the house of God. The length in cubits of the old standard was 60 cubits, and the width 20 cubits. The vestibule in front of the nave of the house was 20 cubits long, across the width of the house, and its height was 120 cubits. He overlaid it on the inside with pure gold. The nave he lined with cypress, covered it with fine gold, and made palms and chains on it. He adorned the house with settings of precious stones. The gold was gold from Parvaim. So he lined the house with gold, its beams, its thresholds, its walls, and its doors, and he carved cherubim on the walls. So if you were to assume that the entire Bible is chronological, which would be problematic anyway, because there's a lot of sections that are intentionally not chronological. But we've already heard about this. This happened not just several chapters ago, several books ago. We heard about the building of the temple, right? So in a way, I like that Chronicles sort of, again, I said, summarizes what we just read. at the end of chapter 5, or in chapter 5, the ark is brought into the temple. And I'm going to skip a lot here. You see various acts of Solomon. Solomon dedicates the temple. Solomon's great wealth, which is interesting in chapter 9. I was trying to figure out how much gold would be 666 talents of gold. By the way, it's 666, and not meant to be evil. By the way, interesting that it's 666. That's a lot of gold. Let me just tell you. In today's standard, that's billions of dollars of gold. So he was rich. We are going to skip to. We have some of the same things we heard about in terms of the divided kingdom, Elijah, a few other things, and we're skipping all the way to chapter 36. The temple cleansed, Assyria invades. We've heard about that. The temple is restored. The reign of Manasseh. The discovery of the book of the law sounds familiar. Celebration of the Passover. And then we come to chapter 36. This is the end of it, but there's a reason I wanted, not just because it's the end, but because I wanted to read part of this to you here. So again, we're going to talk about the exile into Babylon, but it doesn't go into much detail here. So I want you to look at starting with verse 17 of chapter 36. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their youths with a sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or young woman, the aged or the feeble. He gave them all into his hand. All the vessels of the house of God, large and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king and of his officials, all these he brought to Babylon. They burned the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious vessels. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had made up for its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So again, we hear about the fall of Jerusalem and the temple to the Babylonians. But it's sort of it's almost too quick of a summary. We don't hear, it doesn't go into as much details. We just heard at the end of Kings, right? Instead, we hear, okay, this happened, and because they were bad, and was destroyed. But I want to tell you probably the most interesting thing, maybe one of the most interesting things in all of Scripture, and I'm serious about this. Top 10, but it doesn't get talked about much, is this next passage. Does anyone know who King Cyrus is?
Yes.
King Cyrus, who was a Persian, who the Persians conquered Babylon while the Israelites were in Babylon, is praised, a foreign king, praised by several of the prophets. And well, why? I bet you know, Betty Lou.
He gave them permission to go back to Israel and Judah and to reestablish.
He freed the slaves. He freed the exiles in Babylon. So I'm going to give you a little tiny bit of homework here. I want you to Google or look up, or go to a library and look up called the Cyrus cylinder. I talked about this at a Bible study, I don't know, a couple of years ago. So there's it's about this big. I don't know how big it is. It's about this big. I have some Play-Doh on my desk for some reason. About the size of these. And it's a cylinder of clay. And when the news of the day was announced, they took a cylinder of clay and they wrote on it. And then people would take that cylinder of clay and go around to towns and here's the news, right?
Town crier.
A town crier kind of a thing, exactly. And there were probably many of these made. Well, there is one existing, and it's called of this particular one. It's called the Cyrus cylinder. It was one of those times, right? And the Cyrus cylinder says on it that King Cyrus of Babylon of Persia, he was of Babylon too, is freeing all of the slaves, has set them free. So it is because of King Cyrus that the Jews are able to go free and return to Israel. Now, there are times that in even the books of the prophets where there's almost not worship, I hesitate to use the word worship, but high praise in the prophets of Cyrus. And some people, sometimes it's misinterpreted. Well, they're talking to God, they're talking about Jesus, who will come later. Sometimes it's just Cyrus, which is really, Cyrus is highly revered because of, if not for Cyrus, the temple wouldn't get rebuilt, probably, and the people would not be restored. So I like that Chronicles ends with the people returning to Israel because of Cyrus.
Mhm.
This foreign king who frees them. So we essentially Chronicles starts from Adam and Eve and ends at Cyrus, because we have the names of all the people from the beginning of history through the settlement in the Promised Land, and then we have the stories in the Promised Land, and we end with Cyrus. So in the first year of the King Cyrus of Persia, in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia, so that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom, and also declared in a written edict, "Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the King of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up." So I'm gonna do it for you here for a second. I invite you to kind of look this up and read about it. I have seen it in person at a museum.
Where is it?
It tours. So I don't know where it is right now. I'm going to show you a picture of the Cyrus cylinder.
Local newspaper.
So
Oh.
it's not very big. It's like the size of a cucumber, a small cucumber. But on that is writing, and that writing, it doesn't ever mention the Jewish people, the Hebrew people by name, but it says, we know from other sources that, and from the Bible, that Cyrus is a Persian king, which is not the same as Babylon, but then Cyrus conquers Babylon. And to this day, we call another name for the people in that region, for Iran and Iraq and a few of those, is Persian. It's Persia. So because Cyrus conquers that area, they take on some of that culture, and one of his first acts is to free the slaves. So it says here, he will free all of the slaves from other lands and let them return to their homes on the Cyrus cylinder. So it's kind of a neat thing. So I'm going to see if I can find somewhere here. I think as part of the text. Okay. Uh, uh, um, um, I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, powerful king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the four quarters of the earth, yada, yada, yada. Uh, um, he frees the inhabitants from their yoke and brought relief to their dilapidated housing and putting an end to their complaints. He repaired the ruined temples and the cities he conquered, restored their cult, returned their sacred images as well as their former inhabitants. So it's the first Emancipation Proclamation. It's the first time that anyone anywhere frees slaves by proclamation, which is a kind of an amazing thing. He didn't have to do that, right? They're essentially his property to do with as he wishes, and he frees them. It's kind of a neat. So I like that Chronicles ends with that. Now, the books of history. Are we done with the books? Are we done with the history section of the Bible? Anyone know? So we've started with Joshua, Judges, Ruth, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. Are there any other books that are considered part of the books of history? And the answer is yes. Ezra and Nehemiah. So I wish I should have made like a chart here. Oh well, I can go back. I'll leave you. I'll leave you on the picture of a slightly different picture of the cylinder. That's the Cyrus cylinder. So it tours, like it'll go to museums of natural history kind of things, and you go see it. And it's kind of neat. I got to see it one time.
There's not much said about it. I've never heard of it before.
Yeah.
And you would think that would be critical.
Pretty important. I know it's documented. Pretty important literary thing in the history of the world. That right there. So if we think of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings as one timeline, because it mostly is, right? From Joshua through Second Kings is pretty chronological. That whole section, and then you have Chronicles, which overlaps the whole thing from the beginning to the end of it. Actually, goes before it and goes to after it, essentially. So one book, well, two books, First and Second Chronicles, overlaps all of that from Joshua through Second Kings. When we come to Ezra and Nehemiah, they are largely after that. They're post-exilic history. So where did we end with just now? We ended with the freeing of the slaves from Babylon. Now we're going to Ezra and Nehemiah, which is largely going to be talking about what's going to happen after exile. What's going to happen after the people come back from exile. So all of those books before, Chronicles does essentially a summary of all of their history. And then we had Joshua through Kings that did a summary of the history from Moses to the exile. So both of those stop at Babylon. Kings stops at Babylon, and so does Chronicles. Well, now we're going to read a little bit more history from what happens between the fall of the people returning in around 500 BC to the time of Jesus almost. So that's what Ezra and Nehemiah is. So we'll get back to the history of those books next week.
Okay, how many of the prophets were during that 500 years? Most of them or part of them?
There's some post-exilic prophets. I would say the majority of the prophets, their heyday is between the Assyrian conquest of Israel, and the return from Babylon. So that sounds like a lot of time. That's actually not that much time. That's from 720 BC to 480 BC, give or take, somewhere around in there. So that's 250 years. In the grand scheme of these history books, that's a pretty small block of time. but there are some post-exilic. Some of Isaiah, the last 10 chapters of Isaiah or 9 chapters of Isaiah, happens after the Babylonian exile. There's a few other of the prophets that happen after the Babylonian exile, but largely the period. So what ends up happening, I don't know the date because hopefully no one watches this and calls me out. At some point in the 200 BC time, the leaders of the temple create the Hebrew Bible canon, the Old Testament, what we think of as kind of like the Old Testament. They decide on the canon. So they can't CANON, one N. So they stop basically accepting new writing about 200 to 250 years before Jesus. So we don't have a lot of writings from between that time and the time of Jesus.
Okay,
What
so
we-
that time was when all of the hierarchy of the temple began to be formed and rule
Yes.
over the Hebrews.
Yeah.
Or the Jewish people.
So we don't have writings from that. Well, we do have writings from that time. It's called the Apocrypha. So the
Okay.
Apocrypha is largely written between the forming of the canon and in 220, I think, BC up to the time of Jesus. So for the people of the temple at the time, well, they were still prophets, but we don't listen to those prophets. We've had our prophets. No one else speaks for God anymore because Isaiah did a good enough job. Where I think some of those books are amazing, right?
Some of those stories are wild.
Some of the books in the Apocrypha are great stories, and we don't get to hear them because the leaders of the temple said, "We have enough." Right? God's not speaking through anybody else anymore. So Ezra and Nehemiah are going to be post-exilic, but before that time when the Old Testament canon is established. So
Okay.
so you have two. I'm giving you two pieces of homework. First homework is on your own. Read about the Cyrus cylinder that is on your screen in front of you, because it's very interesting. And then the other thing is read, since we skipped all of it, read through some of whatever you feel of Chronicles, First and Second Chronicles, because there actually is a lot of interesting story. It summarizes everything, so it's good stuff. But we just read all of those stories over the last 10 weeks, and I didn't want to read it again. So Chronicles is, if I was to suggest one part of the Bible to read to really understand the history of the people, it would be Chronicles. Skip the first, whatever, 8, 9 chapters, so you don't read all those names. But after that, Chronicles is really, it summarizes stuff we've already read, but it does it, it compresses 5 chapters of Kings into a paragraph, right? So
Reader's Digest.
it's a Reader's Digest version
Ah.
of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, right? It's basically Chronicles summarizes all of those 5 books. So read some of Chronicles and read about the Cyrus cylinder, and we will see you next week.
Okay. We are going to have a Bible study next week.
Yeah, I'm still around. I'm still your pastor, dang it.
That's good.
Whether you like it or not, I'm still your pastor for another month.
That's good. That's good.
Good.
Don't try to get rid of me too soon.
Yeah. But it's sad to see you go.
Well,
Yeah.
we'll have time to celebrate
For
you.
more reasons than one, it's sad to see you go.